that in the US, race is conflated with caste. And I think people like Equality Labs are the strongest proponents of this. So could you tell us why this is problematic? And also, we found that a lot of Indian Americans and Indians were trying to fit into movements like the Black Lives Matter, although we have got nothing to do with it. So could you tell us what is this need for trying to fit into that sort of movements?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was growing up and I would read about India, uh, if they actually mention India, because just to keep in mind, anything outside the West was not considered very important. And it would be some version of these white people from Europe, southern Russia came in and kicked out these Dravidians, and then they kicked them out to the south. And then, so it was kind of made into a very racialized thing.
Okay.
And then you get sort of these, a lot of what seem to be to me, people who have sort of internalized a American or a white sort of reflection that is going on within sort of the Western culture of their own history of slavery. Just to keep in mind that it was only until the late 60s that things like interracial marriage laws that were prohibiting interracial marriage laws were struck down.
Oh,
So, like Barack Obama is, biracial, right? If I believe that around the time that his parents were married and he was born, it may not have actually have been legal for his parents to marry in every state in the country. Um, people of his generation. So when you have, especially, say for me and a lot of Indian Americans who come here, we don't necessarily have a direct tie to the oppression and the racism that white people did towards African Americans or Native Americans. But at the same time, we are coming in as English speaking professionals, a lot of cases, and are in institutions that and neighborhoods that are dominated probably most likely with whites, or kind of like Korean immigrants or Chinese immigrants. A lot of us might have small businesses that might serve in minority communities, but at the same time, we may not be fully integrated into them in all cases. And so there tends to be this tension because, on one hand, there is sort of this awareness and tradition, perhaps from India itself, of kind of this, of a very kind of similar type of discourse. And, as more Indians get on Twitter, as more Indians come to the United States, the more that starts to get muddled up. Um, when I was growing up, India was very far, far away. Even a Bollywood movie, it wasn't like, now on YouTube. I mean, I can go watch everything. And uh, so it's very interesting to me nowadays because, when you look at like, say, the Black Lives Matter movement, and this would actually apply to Indians as well as other immigrant groups, but especially, say, Chinese, Koreans, Vietnamese, who all of us tend to have a lot of small businesses, or either that or in these professional classes. So on one hand, there is this awareness of, yes, we are also people of color in our own way, and we have our own experiences with racism. I mean, that can exist. Luckily for me, that wasn't a defining part of my upbringing. But again, that the fact that it wasn't kind of is a source of privilege, to use kind of
right.
the terminology. And so for me, I, on one hand, because as an American, and again, it's my civic dharma, so to speak, that everyone, if the citizens of my country, this is I have to recognize this as sort of my problem as well. And I think even the term Black Lives Matter, I think, is in some ways an allusion to that. It's like, yes, all lives matter, including Black lives, which parentheses have not been prioritized by the government. But at the same time, just because I am dark skinned does not mean I understand their struggle. And in a lot of cases, it's a give and take, because on one hand, many people say this, they're like, well, I came here and, I am a minority and I worked hard and, I did so well. Why can't they get over it? And the thing is, a lot of people say that. I've heard lots of immigrant groups, including Indian, make those statements about African Americans. But then the one retort I would have is like, oh, well, India, you were decolonized 70 years ago. How come you haven't recovered?
Hmm.
Right, right. It's so in those ways, yeah, we can understand. But again, when you have sort of this backdrop of, we have this English language discourse, we have this, history of, a racialized, like these people conquered these
Hmm.
people who are this level are this much lighter skinned than the lower ones. And so when you come to the US, you're not part of this struggle, but you're not actually part of the Indian struggle or as well, because for me, it's like, yeah, I can read about caste and I can point out logical flaws in discussion of caste. I can also push back on sort of one-dimensional caricatures of Indians or Hindus in American society. But at the same time, I don't live in an Indian village.
Right.
I don't
Right.
know that experience. And so there is a
Right.
limit in which I will say, and
Right.
even when I've written, I have not said, not necessarily gone in and challenged like, oh, well, this incident or this thing was misinterpreted, was not actually this, because that's not my expertise. I can point out that there was a bias and a gaze where, you know,
Absolutely.
you can do these, similes like, oh, yeah, maybe in some respects, maybe I can understand maybe a white person's perspective a little bit or an African American's perspective. Maybe in some ways, there is a way that people are oppressed that can correlate with different factors, but there are limits to that, right?
Right. But I think conflating race with caste is very problematic because they're just two different things. And India is often beaten with the caste stick. Although, like an insider, having grown up, born and brought up in India, I don't experience this as they claim or as I've read in the newspapers or whatever they write about India, like at least what the Americans claim. We don't see people going around asking what's your caste or differentiating or
Yeah,
whatever the, yeah. But I don't
it's
think that's the case with racial bias in the US. And I think you can throw some light on that as a person
yeah,
living there.
that's a great question. That's a great point that you made. So, for example, and I agree, like, when people say bring castes in America, like, all I have to say is the every Indian Hindu community I grew up with, it wasn't like today where there are, millions even in just, the state of California alone. But I don't know what people's caste was. We never talked
Yeah,
about it. There are Indians who are not from the region where my family originates from who married into the family. I have no idea what their background is. There are also non-Indians who have married in, and it's, not the end of the world. And so I think people want to find very simple answers. I mean, to give you an example, and this has happened more than once over the years, people will ask me like, "Oh, well, you're dark skinned, so that means you're low caste, right? Because you were conquered by those people." And it's silly,
that's
right? I mean,
ridiculous. Yeah.
it's ridiculous. I mean, you look at even prominent, famous people of upper caste origins, and you look at their parents, like, would you know what caste background they are? I mean, so I can accept that there are regional variations or different things, but it is a way to very simplify an answer.
Sure, we do have the concept of jati as, but that's very, very different from the oppressive horizontal caste structure that they perceive.
Yes, because the what I think people are thinking about when they talk about this is they're thinking about how it was in the US, where,
Exactly. Or in the
you
Europe,
know,
early Europe.
in Europe, this was very documented. Like, if you
Right.
are of European origin, you can go back through these records and see everything, even back to the 16th century.
Absolutely.
Uh, chattel slavery was very distinct in the US. Like, they were
Right.
property, like a car. You could get insurance policies on them. They were traded on Wall Street. This is very documented. And so they're thinking like, okay, there is this pyramid
All
somewhere,
right. So they go
and
around the
everyone,
world with that lens.
yes. And it's like, for me, like, there are cases in which I will ask, like, okay, fine, this person is talking about caste. Like, what are they? Are they this or that? And no one ever gives me a straight answer
Right.
because it's not like that, right? I mean, there is, it's not like there is a matrix of the four Varna categories, and then the whatever thousands and thousands of jatis, and every single one corresponds, right? It's not the case.
Right. So they try to fit us into their categories, and I think that's where the problem arises.
Yeah, and then what also happens, and say a group like Equality Labs, I think is just the latest example of it,
Yeah.
is if you have an agenda or a perspective, whatever your motivation is, you can say these things because again, you're in the United States. You have people who might have a bias lens who are looking for, something, that already conforms to their pre-existing view of the world. So it's a very great story to say that, oh, well, there are these, oppressive, upper caste people who are oppressing these, and that explains every single problem in India. Every single problem in India can be explained because of, and Mr. Rajiv Malhotra has often mentioned this, the caste, cows, and curries thing. It's a very
Absolutely.
simple explanation that doesn't require any time to be spent actually, I don't know, like talking to Indian people, Hindu people. Because in the US, I'll tell you, like, white supremacists, they always interview them. You know exactly how they feel. And yet, for all of these, portrayals and discussions of caste I've seen, I've not one time heard anyone interview, like, say, a Brahmin or, like whatever quote upper caste there is, and then even someone who actually is casteist.
All
We've
right.
never even heard that. So it is like these accusations and this innuendo that goes around that no one ever bothers to go and question. And so if you have an agenda, you can just say it.
All right. So there's just place for one side of the narrative. There's no option given to the other side.
Yeah, because they don't care.
Yeah. Right. I think that's the important point here. Like, this is what we want to propagate, so you like it or not, this is what you've got to hear.
Yeah, because you know you could go into a lot of things, say with Equality Live specifically. They have a very long report. I encourage everyone to actually read it very carefully. And I will be honest, like I was not as skeptical of them until I read the report very carefully. Because, being here in the US and also I'm in a very diverse sort of social circle. So it's not like I was on a daily basis attuned to, these types of things. But it's when you read it, and then you realize like this actually is influencing decision making in
Oh,
certain cases, you're like, wait a minute, like would any other circumstance why would just one group, not very transparent, if you look at the methodology, you can find a lot of things like, they exclude, for example, people from Fiji or the Caribbean who are Hindus who responded to their survey. And, coincidentally, that also happens to be places where Hindu movements that are explicitly anti-caste tended to become popular because after a few generations, these divisions didn't matter anymore.
right.
And if you even compare that to the UK, where they actually looked at caste legislation, they did a whole study, they had methodology, they went through and they said, yes, there is something going on. Like the caste is real. Like there are communities that are, not treated well, but they also recognize Jati and Varna are different. They also said, wait a minute, we're not going to say, oh, this is our caste population because they don't track the castes of all of their Indian origin citizens, right? So they admitted that they don't know. So then why is it that you have one group where, okay, they did a survey. They did a survey that easily any one of who's watching this right now could do and set up and have people fill in.
Wow.
And, so I think that should be a lesson for people.
Right, absolutely. And that's very good. And to what extent do Indian Americans have any right or obligation on Indian politics?
It's a great question. So for me personally, I believe that it is not my business, so to speak, in the sense that India is a democratic society. Unless there is some issue with the legitimacy of India's elections, if you want to come at me for having some position, on Indian politics, which I don't. But that's really onus is on, well, you have to go convince people within the system in India to vote and to vote for the candidates you want. As an American, this is where I vote. A lot of things that actually motivate me to get out to the polls are local issues, housing costs, or, I want someone to fix the roads, these types of concerns. And I have enough respect for people in India to say, well, I don't know the conditions on the ground. I can engage intellectually on things like Hinduism and things on how it's discussed, but I also know that there is a limitation, right? And I would expect also the other way around. I would encourage, when people come here, that as a community, we have to integrate into the society for the long-term interests that we have. And I think that it's possible for us to do it, but it's also that, I think there's an opportunity, just to keep a kind of boundary between it.
Right. Right. So, as an insider, do you find a lot of Indian Americans interested in Indian politics? Are there discussions happening, or is it like we're least bothered? We don't really.
It's very
Okay.
variable. I would say that there is definitely a segment of, say, especially both kind of sides of the partisan divide, in the conservatives as well as progressives. There is a lot of range because, again, you have a lot of Indian Americans who are from professional families. They are educated, like we've talked about. They have sort of this consciousness and this perspective of, being a minority, but not really sort of having dealt with some of the challenges that maybe other communities have. So you get all sorts of it. And so you get a lot of people, say, for example, who might actually take on positions that would be perceived as anti-India. And whether it comes from the kind of things that they read, or also, quite frankly, if you have really strict controlling parents in the United States, that's not, that sort of the Brahminical patriarchy that people talk about. They might actually just be talking about, like, kind of what are they experiencing, kind of within their own networks.
Right.
But, you know, I think that for the most part, and there are a lot of people who sort of just kind of move on and, are focused on kind of local concerns, or, their own careers. And, I'm one of those people, like, I have a day job, I have a life. Uh,
Yeah.
but I think, again, it comes back to this mentality where I think where I grew up in a time where there weren't a lot, I didn't expect a lot of Indians to be here, and it was disconnected. And so I kind of grew up with a consciousness of, what values do I preserve from India and from the Hindu tradition, the dharmic tradition, but also, where do I say, like, okay, this is, my responsibility is here, and while at the same time recognizing that there is an interest in, India's success, as an ally, from this country.
Right. What are some of the problems that you see in the Indian American community in
You know,
terms?
there are, again, kind of like in India, if you were to ask ask 10 different Indian Americans this question, you're going to get 10 different answers.
Absolutely.
Um, I think that we do have to, I would strongly sort of encourage other fellow Indian Americans to think about how we can both coalesce and kind of unify as a community, and be mindful about which sort of divisions we want to import from the ancestral country, as well as how do we build coalitions with other people, because in a lot of ways, the some of the interests we have are very common. Like, if you want to talk about small business owners, if you're a Gujarati or Punjabi small business owner, that's a very similar set of interests that you might have with Vietnamese, with Iranians, with Koreans, right? In terms of what you want your government, your local city government to do. And so these are things where, you both work inward, you preserve your identity, but also figure out, like, okay, how do I get out of my own limited bubble And while with mutual respect and recognizing that not everyone is going to have my concerns and I don't necessarily understand everyone's concerns, but what are common interests, that we can work towards.
That's great. I hope that happens.
Yeah, yeah. I've been very encouraged. I mean, sometimes uh, I see, because with Twitter and, especially being in California, like India is like here in, in day to day in a way that it never was. Because again, like I've grown up being the only one, the token one. So now it's just like everyone's Indian. So
Uh,
it's a bit, interesting. But
it's a bit
yeah,
easier with technology.
it's a bit easier with technology, but I just hope that we don't make it something that ends up confusing and muddling things. I think that there are ways that in India you could solve problems that don't need to be the way that we do it because we're not perfect. And also, if you're coming here, if you want to settle and make your life here, like, what is the commitment or what type of things do you want to bring and what do you want to bring back?
Right.
We had to make those choices. We had to make a lot of sacrifices, right? We could not live, exactly, in terms of daily ritual, daily habits that, however my grandparents lived, 50, 75 years ago, right?
Right. Right. Thank you, Damo. This was a wonderful conversation, and thanks for joining us. We'll
Yeah,
look
pleasure to
for
be here.
more conversations with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Namaste.